thank you once again for coming along this evening. Today we're going to look at some rather major problems we have in the Western world, especially during this month of commemoration of Columbus's discovery of the New World. This is a time which should concern us all because there's a great deal to rethink about Columbus Day, not just here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but generally in America and well beyond America, because the importance of Columbus was global. And we're beginning to realize that many of the mistakes that we've made since 1492 are just now coming home to roost, as it were, in cultural terms. The cultural lag has been considerable, but the cultural impact even more considerable, and we're just having to start to face up to some of the misplaced metaphors and huge wrong conclusions that we have drawn as a culture from the Columbian event. So today we're going to look at what's called, in effect, drawing the wrong conclusions. An anthropologist looks at history, cultural mistakes since 1492, the frontier metaphor and the myth of endless growth. In effect, there are several big mistakes since 1492, but at the core of them is the emergence of the frontier metaphor as a socially guiding metaphor for many cultures in Western civilization. We're going to take a look at that today because it's very problematic. What do anthropologists do in studying humans? Well, there's a number of things, but they start off with the premise of two-fold nature of the problem. Anthropologists are committed to the notion of the unity of humankind and the diversity of cultures. That is, we're one race, the human race. We're one species, but there are a wide variety of cultures, and both things need to be emphasized simultaneously all the time. The unity of humankind and the variety of cultures. Further, there's no one who can grow up without a culture. There's no such thing as humans without culture, so we need to be very careful in studying cultures because everyone has one, and everyone is quite closely attached to them. Culture, in fact, is learned behavior, and it's important to emphasize that because it's not instinctual. It's not natural, it's second nature. It's what we learn so early and so thoroughly that we never question it. And in that respect, we need to keep in mind that it's deeply ingrained. So what do we do in studying humankind is to concentrate on the human universals and the cultural differences. Cultural differences become apparent when we examine how human communities situate themselves and behave in the broader ecosystem. They aren't apparent until you see how people think about their environment and start to behave in it. How do we study the cultural differences of humans and ecosystems? Well, there's a threefold approach in anthropology, and one is cultural ecology. This is basically taking the culture that you're studying seriously and learning how it looks at the world. What are its categories of perception? How does it see grass, shrubs, trees? What are its vocabularies for these kinds of things? How does it view animals? How does it relate to them? What are the cultural categories? And that's what you study in cultural ecology. The second approach, though, is ecological anthropology. And that's saying, well, it doesn't really matter what you think things are. The question is, how are you behaving? And this steps back from the question from within any particular culture to the question of looking at humans as an animal in an ecosystem. Whatever else we are. We are bipedal mammalian omnivores, right? I mean, that's not usually the way we describe ourselves as human beings, but an ecological anthropologist will say, okay, here we have a bipedal mammalian omnivore. How does it go about behaving in its ecosystem? Does it cut down trees? Does it look for edible grasses? Does it shoot animals? Does it eat fish? All of those things can be described independent of any of the categories within a culture that we use to describe fish, meat, grass, or the like, because they can be measured just like they can be observed and measured in reference to any other animal. In this case, a bipedal mammalian omnivore. This doesn't distinguish us, for example, from the apes, but there are some behavioral things we do differently, and we learn a lot by looking at that in ecological anthropology. The third aspect of things is to look at the ecology of cultures. If culture is a human universal, cultures vary enormously. How do they come to vary? Why do they vary? Why don't we just have one culture? Well, it's because we've had very different experiences, and we've understood those experiences in a different way. To put it another way, a culture is a social appropriation of an experience within an ecosystem. Sounds a little complicated, but it's not when you look into it in detail. How can we study, though, the ecology of any particular culture? Well, as I indicated, a culture is an association of learned behaviors and habits, the second nature of a people who have lived with one another over time in a particular eco-niche or ecological setting. Now, what's apparent is that, in part, a culture can be said to be the social appropriation of a group's history, a bundle of metaphors and rules of thumb that help them understand who they are, where they are, and, in some sense, where they're going. Language, the group's language, the internal language, is key to this whole process, because that's how people talk to one another about their experience of socially appropriating their own experience of history, and it's how they talk to others about it. So it's crucial not just to learn language as an instrumental question of learning how to communicate with people. You've got to learn the internal categories of a language as an indication of how a particular culture understands its place in the world and then behaves. Well, in the language, then, we can examine in detail the fundamental themes of a culture, which seem to encapsulate a group's self-image and govern its behavior. This is crucial because it's those fundamental metaphors that are absolutely essential. In short, we're looking for the metaphors that people live by. They live by metaphors. We don't live in experience, we live by way of our image of experiences. And it's those metaphors that are encapsulated by a culture and determine how people behave in an ecosystem. Well, how has the ecology of culture changed in the world since 1492? Interesting problem to put to ourselves, and one which is essentially a cultural problem that we have to look at in detail. The issue is, in a sense, well beyond any particular culture, but it has to do with the overall problem of cultural appropriation of knowledge. In this case, we can look at the ways in which racism and rubbish have emerged as problems of boundary in an ecosystem, especially in colonial circumstances. So this I analyzed a while back in a series of articles, one called Rubbish and Racism, Problems of Boundary in an Ecosystem. And we saw at the outset of that article a citation of William Butler Yeats' Meditations in Time of Civil War, a poem that he wrote, observing that we had fed the heart on fantasies, the heart's grown brutal from the fair. This, in effect, is what has happened since 1492 to most of the Western world. And we turn to anthropologists to sort it out. In an age of mounting racial tensions and in the presence of an impending environmental crisis, it may seem irresponsible for anthropologists to fly off to remote corners of the world and continue their studies of people who, even if they do survive, will have no effect upon the world's major problems. As research money becomes scarce, government agencies and foundations appear to agree that such fieldwork is a luxury that they can ill afford. Anthropologists, of course, have always maintained that their research has been intimately bound up with the total human condition. And if their peoples seem remote and their theories esoteric, this has been so only in order to make a fresh approach possible to the problems we all face daily. This is their claim, and we can hold them to it. If anthropologists have been right, then they should have something to offer concerning two of the major crises which confront us: the growth of racism and the threat of irreversible environmental pollution. Those are the challenges we face. Is anthropology up to understanding how we've gotten here? Basically, anthropologists look at history and say we need to re-examine the driving myths and delusional metaphors at the core of this experience if we are going to survive. The experience is that of 1492 onwards. One of the things we need to re-examine is the experience itself. Is it all it was cracked up to be?
In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, begins the poem memorized by generations of schoolchildren learning about the discovery of America. The new book says Chinese explorers beat Columbus here by some 70 years. Chinese explorer Zheng He made several remarkable journeys in the early 15th century. His explorations are the subject of a new book by Gavin Menzies, 1421, the year China discovered America. The author says he has found irrefutable evidence that the explorer and or others under his command were the first to circumnavigate the globe. Menzies says he uncovered the information inadvertently.
I started off writing a story about the year 1421, and during the course of it I came to the astonishing conclusion that a huge Chinese fleet of 800 vessels had sailed from China in March 1421, and they'd circumnavigated the world, and they had created settlements in North and South America, in Australia, New Zealand, across the Pacific, and in the Indian Ocean.
Now, how did you come up with this information?
When the book was ready, I sent it out to a number of historians to check the accuracy of what I'd written. And one of them came back to me and said, "Do you know about the chart which shows islands in the Caribbean, which was drawn 70 years before Columbus set sail for the Caribbean?" And when I looked at this chart, I realized that the islands on it were Puerto Rico and Guadeloupe. And it seemed to me that there had been secret Portuguese voyages to the Caribbean 70 years before Columbus set sail. And I found to my complete astonishment that far from the Portuguese having made secret voyages to the Caribbean, they had actually sent caravels to look for these islands, which were shown on a master chart of the world, which had been carried back to Portugal in the 1420s by Prince Dom Pedro. And the Portuguese claim was that the entire world appeared on this master chart. And I found to my, again, astonishment that the whole world was charted before any of the great explorers, before Columbus, Diaz, Cabral, Magellan or da Gama set forth.
And you think the chart was drawn by the Chinese?
Yes, it was.
So who is the Columbus of China?
It was a eunuch, a man who had his penis and testicles severed when he was a young boy of 12, and he entered the emperor's service, and he joined up with the emperor Chu Ti, and he was appointed as commander-in-chief of this great fleet. And he was a very, very remarkable man, and he trained his admirals and instructed them how to control fleets, and his fleets reached the whole world.
Well, this is staggering. Before Columbus, in 1421, in fact, the Chinese seem to have made it to America, and you can follow some of this, if you wish, by looking at the web material on it, and in fact tracing the voyages of the fleet. They have put up an animated indication of this in such a way that you can look at it and follow it on a regular basis. The journey was pretty extraordinary. A whole fleet that went around southern Africa, basically, and then circumnavigated part of it back to India and then to China, but part around southern Africa, and then split up into two different directions, explored the Caribbean and North America, the coastline, even going around Greenland, according to some, and around the northern part, and eventually making several trips, including around South America and across the Pacific, in such a way that basically the Chinese had circumnavigated the world in several different ways before the Europeans, but significantly before, and in effect had created some of these global charts that were pre-existent prior to Columbus. Now, most of us don't hear about this or think about it in any cultural sense because we're so bound up with the notion that Columbus made the trip. And when we look comparatively at the size of Columbus's ship when compared to the Chinese junks, it's not very impressive. And in fact, it looks pretty measly by comparison. But these things seem to have been swept aside by what was called the Columbian Exchange. The world certainly would be a different ecologic phenomena if the Chinese had sustained the contact with the New World, but the Chinese never followed up their discovery with sustained contact. And the result was that it was the sustained contact from the Europeans and its ecological impact, traced by people like Alfred Crosby here, looking at the biological consequences of 1492, and later in his book called Ecological Imperialism, that we can understand why it was that the European presence came to dominate and present, in effect, a new kind of world based out of European ecological imperialism. The biological expansion of Europe from 900 to 1900 is his topic of his book, and it began to be the subject of why there was this great divergence between China, Europe, and the making of the modern world. Why didn't China follow up its discoveries in the same way that Europe did? And non-Western historians have written about this as well. A fellow named Prasannan Parthasarath has written about it too, why Europe grew rich and Asia did not, subtitle of which is Global Economic Divergence from 1600 to 1850. Well, if you look at that early history, you learn a lot. Columbus ran into the islands in the Caribbean and discovered one after another and explored them. And we have various images of that going on, but he did more than that. He opened up the floodgates, in a sense, for maritime empires to start to move to the continents themselves, both in Central America, South America, and North America. And in that movement, there was a movement on land, especially with horses and munitions that had never been used locally. And in addition to the 80 to 90% of the population wiped out by plagues, there was a straightforward conquest of territory on continents. Moving from the islands to the continent, the illusion of continuous westward frontier became a dominant metaphor for Europeans moving in the area. The frontier metaphor in effect dominated the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, so much so that it became, in effect, a frontier theme that elected the youngest president ever at the time. So persuasive was this metaphor of frontiers that even school children were repeating it, and they made up reports like this. Listen to it. It's really amazing when you think of it.
Do you want a man for president who's seasoned through and through, but that's a doggone season that he won't try something new? A man who's old enough to know
and young enough to do.
well, it's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you.
In 1960, John Fitzgerald Kennedy ran for president. He won the Democratic primary against Senator Hubert Humphrey, and upon his victory delivered his Democratic National Convention address, one of many famous and inspiring speeches. In it, he reminds Americans that although they may have faced many struggles, they still have a ways to go. His aim, which became that of the people, was to make America a better country than it was before, and to keep building successes on top of each other.
Some would say that those struggles are all over, that all the horizons have been explored, that all the battles have been won, that there is no longer an American frontier. But I trust that no one in this assembly would agree with that sentiment. For the problems are not all solved, and the battles are not all won. And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier.
A new frontier became his metaphor for taking over the country, in effect. And it was based on this notion of economic growth, which was sort of a continuous expansion of the frontier beyond the physical fact of the frontier. It kept going, especially as a non-communist alternative in the Cold War to the communist threat. Economic growth became the new frontier, and he expressed it in reference to his space program, and that became the new metaphor for expansion. Company profit, global warming wasn't thought about. Everything was expanding to such an extent that frontiers of space became a huge misplaced metaphor. It makes no sense to expand in a linear sense off a sphere. And Columbus should have made that clear to us, right? That the world was round. He did make it clear to us in a way, but Columbus, in a sense, by opening up the frontier metaphor, created the biggest era of flat earthism in all of human history. Stephen Hawking now wants to go off into frontiers of space and talks about it as the next frontier. Well, we need to rethink these things because we're drawing the wrong conclusions from 1492. We should have learned that the world was round, that it was a sphere, that there are no such things as frontiers on spheres. You ultimately come back to source. And the frontier metaphor can't be extended by growth infinitely. As Yeats put it, we had fed the heart on fantasies. The heart's grown brutal from the fair. And I'm afraid we've got to overcome the frontier metaphor if we want to make progress toward survival.
This is Noam Chomsky. You're watching Cambridge Community TV.